Welcome back, and here we go again. I'm still running a little bit behind schedule. I didn't quite finish in my last lecture what I had planned to do. The lecture was supposed to be the second part of the chapter on the Jefferson administration, which then spilled over into, started with his efforts to deal with what the United States could do while England and France were engaged in those major wars that we call the Napoleonic Wars. And Jefferson tried to stay out of that. He wanted to make the United States remain neutral. Ultimately, he failed. His successor then, Madison, ended up getting us into a war with England. And as I was saying, and I was talking about that war, it did not go well for the United States. I talked about some of the things that were going wrong, some of the problems we had, some of the obstacles we faced, some of the reasons why most of our military combat with the British turned out very poorly. There were a couple of bright spots. We did have some successful invasions of Canada. There were a couple of places we went to battle against the British up in Canada. Most of those ended in failure because, as I told you, we expected the Canadian people to join us, and they had no inclination to do that. That was a total misconception by our part. We were just totally wrong about thinking that the Canadians were anxious to join the United States. They wanted to have nothing to do with us. We did have, in one battle though, we did manage to kill Tecumseh. Tecumseh had fled to Canada to escape the United States, and so that was a tragedy for the Indian people, but it was a victory for the white people that during the war we killed Tecumseh in one of those battles up in Canada, which overall didn't go well, but during the middle of it we did manage to kill Tecumseh. Another bright spot occurred after the British occupied Washington, D.C. In early 1814, the British Army landed and took over the city of Washington, our capital, which was not very much of a city at the time. There was very little building there. We just started to build the city. We're still working on the capital. Only had a couple of other buildings around, but those were all burned down by the British. They totally just devastated what there was of the city of Washington. So that was another one of our losing battles. But after they took over Washington, the British planned to march north up along Chesapeake Bay and eventually go up to and take over Baltimore and then Philadelphia and then New York and take the whole eastern coast of the United States, or at least the northeastern coast. And in order to get to their first target, which was Baltimore, it's only about 40 miles north of Washington, they had to go by an American fort called Fort McHenry, and they attempted to destroy that fort so they could march along that road, and they failed. Fort McHenry survived an onslaught, and so the British Army had to turn back, and eventually they withdrew from North America and went back down to somewhere in the West Indies to kind of regroup and see if they could come up with a plan B. Plan A having been stopped at Fort McHenry. So that was one of the bright spots, that they did take Washington, and they planned to expand beyond that, and that was unsuccessful. So that was a success for us. But overall, the war went very poorly. Our army did badly. In most cases, the Bank of the United States was gone, so we had a hard time financing the war. That was a struggle, something that Hamilton hoped to avoid, and so his idea of having the Bank of the United States turned out to be just ineffective, because when we needed the bank, it had been shut down the year before. Its charter expired, and the Republicans were not about to renew it. One of the things the Republicans had always stood for was opposition to the Bank of the United States. That was one of their founding principles back in 1791, and they certainly were not about to renew its charter in 1811. So we didn't have a bank, and so we didn't have a way to finance the war smoothly and easily as Hamilton had hoped. We did sort of scramble around and borrow money here and borrow money there and try to finance things, but it was very difficult and went very poorly. And then a key factor was that the country was very divided. There were many people opposed to the war, especially people in New England. And what had happened was that in New England, the Whig Party, which had been, not the Whig Party, the Federalist Party, which had been on the decline ever since 1800, it had been losing elections. People were not voting for the Federalist Party anymore. In many places, the party had sort of ceased to exist. But it got a new birth of life in New England because of the unpopularity of the war. The war was just very much opposed in New England. And as a matter of fact, in New England, in the fall of 1814, the war has been going on now for about 2 years, several of the state legislatures up there decided to do something that we've seen legislatures do previously, to have a convention, to get together and talk about their opposition to the war. I mean, this has been the kind of thing that American legislatures have been doing ever since the Stamp Act. You know, that the legislatures, then called the assemblies, would each adopt a resolution, send delegates to some site, and get together and talk about what they can do collectively to deal with an issue that they don't like, whether it be the Stamp Act or the problems of the Articles of Confederation, whatever. In this case, it was the opposition to the war. So the New England states had a convention in Hartford, and they discussed ways that they could resist the war. And they talked about just things that they were doing and various ways to assert their disapproval of the war. The kind of things that they came up with were things like that they would not allow their state militias to be used outside of the state. They would not allow the state militias to be involved in the war against England. They would not allow any state tax revenues to be used for military purposes. They would not allow the Army recruiters to come into their state and recruit young men to serve in the United States Army. And they just in general were trying to find ways to block the war effort in their states in New England. And some of the delegates there even proposed, and the convention did not adopt this, but they even proposed that the states secede from the Union, that New England states should decide not to stay part of the United States any longer, that they would in a sense revoke their ratification of the Constitution. Their theory was based on the idea that they had joined the Union back in 1787-88, whenever, by ratifying the Constitution. Now they're going to unratify it and take themselves out of the Union. Now, just think about that. These are the Federalists. This is the party of Alexander Hamilton. This is the party that was based on the principle that the United States was a single nation. That was sort of the underlying theme of the whole Federalist Party, was that the United States was a single unified nation, and their opponent is the Republicans, who said that we're a federation of states, and it was, you know, those Republicans who did things such like adopting the Virginia and Kentucky resolves, which said that a state was still sovereign and could overrule Congress. And the Federalists totally reject that. They're all in favor of the idea that the United States is simply a single nation. And now here it's the Federalists who are talking about having each state secede and become a sovereign state, not part of the United States anymore. Poor Alexander Hamilton, who had been dead for over 10 years, but if he were alive, he would have just been horrified at what his party has become. It's the total opposite. What was left of the Federalist Party had gone even further than the Republicans had ever gone. I mean, the Republicans were saying that a state could overrule Congress. Well, the Federalists now here are saying a state can drop out of the Union. That's an extreme step, and it shows how far the Federalists were in opposing the war, and it shows how much the war was hated within New England, that the delegates at the Hartford Convention would go so far. They did not adopt that resolution. They talked about it, but they didn't accept that. But there was that thought was there in Hartford during the fall and into the winter of 1814. So the war is just very unpopular in some parts of the country, and we're losing. It's not going well. Fortunately for us, in England, there was also a lot of opposition to the war. And the issue in England was that England, at the same time that they were fighting us, they were fighting France, they were fighting Napoleon. And there were a lot of people in England who said the war against the United States was an unnecessary distraction. They said that England should not be getting into a war with the United States, but should be focusing all of its resources, all of its manpower, all of its money on the war against Napoleon, which is the great threat to humanity and so forth. So there were English politicians who were suggesting that England should somehow get out of that war. And then their allies were also very unhappy with England for going to war against the United States. One of their great allies was Russia, and Russia was very much involved in the war against Napoleon. Some of you may know that Napoleon invaded Russia and almost captured Moscow, and had it not been for the terrible winter weather of 1814, Napoleon might have succeeded. The Russians fought a huge battle just outside of Moscow and defeated Napoleon and turned him away. So Russia is fighting for its very existence against Napoleon, and Russia is then saying to England, their ally, why are you not devoting all of your efforts to helping us? We're supposed to be allies fighting together against France. What are you doing fighting against the United States? So England was under a lot of pressure to get out of the war too. So sort of both sides have real strong incentives to get that war over. In the June of 1814, when the war's been going on now for about 2 years, the Tsar of Russia persuaded England and the United States to meet together to start negotiating their differences and finding a way to end the war. And with his leadership and his intervention, trying to persuade both sides that, look, you both want to get out of that war, let's get together. So delegates, negotiators from the United States and Britain met in the town of Ghent, which is now part of Belgium. There was no country of Belgium at that time. But the city of Ghent was there, and it was in a neutral area of Europe. So that became the site of negotiations between the United States and Great Britain. And even though both sides really wanted to get out of the war, the negotiations did not go well, because the issues that had led to the war were just unsolvable. The United States absolutely insisted on its right to trade as a neutral nation. And England absolutely refused to permit or to allow any restrictions on the use of its navy. The English had always relied for defense on the navy. England was a maritime nation. Their whole wealth and power was built on the back of its navy, because its navy would protect their trade, and England was this great trading nation. And if you remember, England had become the greatest and most powerful nation in the world because of its trade, And so it relied very intensely on its navy to protect its trade. And in war, it counted on its navy to go out and stop trade with the other side as a key feature of its efforts to win the war. And for them to accept America's right to trade in war would have undermined their whole military operation. So they simply could not accept that. And the other big issue was, if you remember, the whole question of impressment. As I told you, that was absolutely essential to the Navy. If they couldn't have impressment, they couldn't have a Navy. So they just simply would not accept that. And the United States just insisted that England could no longer impress our sailors into their Navy. So that was just not solvable. And then we want Canada, and there's just no way that England is going to give up Canada, especially because they know that most Canadians are loyal to their king and hostile to the United States. So why would they in any way consent to turning their subjects in Canada over to the United States, which they view as an enemy? So the negotiations couldn't go anywhere. And it's kind of up and down. There was a time there while the negotiations are going on in the fall of 1814 that the British captured Napoleon, and it looked like the war was going to be over and that they were going to be able to win the war against France. So then they felt they could continue the war against the United States, so they were very reluctant to make any concessions because it looked like the war was in their hands. Victory was close, so they were not about to give it up. And then Napoleon escaped from the British and went out and renewed his war. So now England's got the war back again, so now they become more amenable to negotiations. It's up and down, it's back and forth. And finally the delegates just decided the negotiators decided, let's just quit. Let's just not try to solve the issues. We can't solve them. But we've got to stop the war. We both just want to end the war. So in December of 1814, actually on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1814, England and the United States signed the Treaty of Ghent. And it's something that is kind of common in European diplomacy. And it had been a feature of European diplomacy for centuries, and you can kind of tell it's something that they've been doing for a long time because the term that they used is still in Latin. So they were still using a Latin phrase that they've been using forever in European diplomacy and European wars and so forth. The term is status quo ante bellum, status quo ante bellum. And it roughly translates into English as the same thing as before the war. And what it means is we're going to stop fighting. We're not going to have this war anymore. We're going to all take our armies home and stop the actual fighting. And we won't deal with any of the issues. We'll deal with those later. We'll pick up where we stopped negotiating when we went to war. We'll go back to that point and see if we can find a solution. And we'll keep working on it, we'll keep negotiating, but we won't be fighting. We'll just put the guns down and get the battlefields closed down and let the negotiators go back to work and see if they can find a solution. And they'll just sort of pick up where they had left off when we ended up fighting. The same thing, just exactly the same place, the status quo, exactly where it was before the war started, before we started fighting. And we'll deal with the other issues. We still have to deal with a lot of issues, but let's not keep fighting. In the meantime, let's just stay at peace so that we're not out there killing each other and spending a lot of money and tearing our countries apart. So the treaty was signed. But it's kind of odd because the word of that treaty took a couple of weeks to get to the United States. I mean, before the word could come here and let the two armies know that the parties have signed a treaty to end the war. And it's kind of ironic because if you remember the beginning of the war, the United States declared war because England would not repeal its orders in council. And then after we declared war, then we got the news that took a little while to get here, that in fact England had repealed its orders in council. So the beginning of the war was sort of marred by the fact that it just took time for news to travel across the Atlantic in those days. And that was an issue when the war started, and now it becomes an issue when the war ends. Because without knowing that the war was over, the British Army down in the West Indies had come up with their Plan B. And their Plan B was to land at New Orleans and drive up along the Mississippi River, take possession of the river all the way up to its source in Minnesota, control the Mississippi, and by doing that, in effect, divide the United States in half. I mean, that's what they're planning to do. And then to be in that very strong position to go to the United States and say, look, we've split your country, and now give us this and that and the other, and among other things, maybe they could say, well, we're going to take the Louisiana Territory. We want to have all that land in the West that we can add on to Canada up to the north of there. So that's their strategy. Well, the U.S. Army sort of figured out that that was their strategy. They had guessed. They did have some spies who gave them some hints of what the British were up to. And they knew that they were planning to land at New Orleans. And they figured out, well, if they're going to be there, there's only a certain number of places where they're going to go. They're going to have to go up here. They're going to have to go over to take this place here, and they're going to have to go over and take this little valley there. And as they move, they're going to have to be going here and here and here. And the Army, very correctly and very successfully, exactly anticipated what the British were going to do. And the U.S. Army stationed troops along the way that they expected the British to go. They just guessed, but they guessed 100% correctly. And they sent troops there, and they were very carefully barricaded. They were, behind walls and embankments and so forth that the Army hastily built up, and the soldiers could hide behind that. And as the British came marching up, they could fire at them, and we could fire at them with our cannons and so forth, and we could stop their advance. And it worked very well. The Battle of New Orleans took place over several days in January of 1815, the early days of the month of January, and was a complete victory for the United States Army. We inflicted heavy casualties on the British, and our casualties were minimal. I mean, there's like 8 American soldiers were killed, hundreds of British soldiers were killed, and the entire British Army had to surrender to the American Army. A great, great victory. And the man who was responsible for planning that, the American general, who was the great hero of the Battle of New Orleans, was a man who we'll be hearing about more later. His name was Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson was the military general he had a little bit of espionage information that he picked up from some French pirates who had been over around the British and sort of figured out what was going on a little bit, and so he had some clues as to what was happening, but mostly it was just his skill in looking at maps, anticipating where things were. The British didn't have as good a view of knowledge of the maps. They sort of had to kind of wing it, and they kind of screwed some things up, but Jackson was just ready for them. The U.S. Army was ready for them with his leadership and his placing of the soldiers. A great success, a great victory. A real positive thing for the United States after a couple of years of very poor results in battles. we had a great victory at the Battle of New Orleans. And Andrew Jackson became well known in the United States. His name was just treated as one of the great heroes of America because of his success in defeating the British Army and in pulling the United States out of what had been a kind of a losing thing, and now we're the great victors. You may have heard, though, that, and you should understand that this battle came after the signing of the treaty. And so some people will say that, well, the battle was irrelevant because the war was over. Well, that's not quite true. The treaty had been signed, but if you remember, treaties always have to be ratified. I mean, the treaty is negotiated by our diplomats in Ghent, but it's not official until it's ratified. And in the United States, I think I mentioned this about ratification of Jay's Treaty, the treaty has to be ratified by the President. This is what the Constitution says. The President has to ratify a treaty, and he must have the advice and consent of 2/3 of the Senate in order to ratify the treaty. And the treaty had not been ratified, so it's not official yet at the time of the battle. It hasn't been ratified by the United States. It hasn't been ratified by England. And, we can start thinking about, well, what would have happened if the battle had not been an American victory? What if the British had scored a victory as decisive and as extreme as Jackson's victory? What if it had gone the other way? And remember, for England, the war with France is now over. They've defeated Napoleon. Now they've got this great victory over the United States. They might just decide, well, let's not ratify the treaty. Let's just keep the war going. We're in a very strong position. We've just demolished Jackson's army. They just demolished the U.S. Army that was blocking the Mississippi. And now we can continue to take that, and maybe we'll get something. And, we'll get a big benefit from going to war here. We can take all of the Louisiana Territory or whatever. We're going to be able to get a very positive response from the United States, having just destroyed their army. And so England might not ever have ratified that treaty if it had not been for Jackson's victory. But the fact that Jackson did win the victory meant that, this was very important, because then for the British, they couldn't wait fast enough to get that treaty ratified and get that war over. They didn't have an army in America. Their army had been all captured, either killed or captured. So they just wanted to get the war over really fast. The war had always been unpopular, and they just couldn't wait to get out of that war. So Jackson's victory did seal our success in the war. The war was over. And it was immediately ratified by both sides after the Battle of New Orleans. Well, I want to talk a little bit about now the consequences of the war. The war is over, and let me see what we came out of with that. Let me look at some of the things that happened. First of all, one thing to mention is that a consequence of the war was that the name of Andrew Jackson became well known in the United States. He was not anybody that anybody knew about previously. He had been involved in some other things, but was not a national figure. But as a result of the war, Andrew Jackson became a national figure, and we'll hear about him. And he's going to go into politics, and so that'll be one of the consequences, is that it made Andrew Jackson a national figure. Second thing I want to just finish up with. As a result of the war, we did kill Tecumseh, and I've said I think probably a lot of people would say Tecumseh was really a great man, and part of the reason for viewing him so greatly is that whole Indian confederation that he was building, and he was putting it together, was largely based on him as an individual. Indians just respected and admired him so much because of the qualities that he had and his skills, his leadership, his ability. And without him, the whole Confederation collapsed. And so the resistance that Tecumseh had been managing to mount to halt our westward expansion, and our westward expansion had been delayed because of the success of Tecumseh and his allies. But with him gone, now we can go back to normal. We can revert to our standard Indian policy, which has been our policy with Indians forever, which was just to force them out of their ancestral lands and drive them off to the west. And so Indians in the areas that we had been after and that where Tecumseh was blocking us, areas that are now like in the states of Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin, Michigan, and so forth. Now those Indians were removed. The Wisconsin, the Illini, the Kickapoo, various nations, Tecumseh's own tribe of the Shawnee, they were moved out to places. The Shawnee were moved to somewhere what is now Kansas, and in general the whole march of Americans to take over Indian land is now back on force now that Tecumseh has been removed. So that was one of the consequences. I'm not going to say whether that was good or bad. It was just that was the reality. That the death of Tecumseh removed the one great resistance to our standard policy of forced Indian removal. Another consequence of the war was the aftermath of the Hartford Convention. The Hartford Convention was still meeting when the news of Jackson's victory arrived in that area. And the Hartford Convention was based on opposition to the war. Well, now it looks like the war has been a great success for America. So the Federalist Party, which was the mover of that whole Hartford Convention, the Federalist Party, now is viewed as treason, as betrayal of the United States. They were arguing against the war at the very time that we're gaining this great victory. So it made the Federalist Party look very, very bad. And as I told you, the Federalist Party had been declining ever since 1800. The Federalists had not won a national election since Adams beat Jefferson in 1796. They lost the election of 1800. They've been losing ever since. They've lost the presidency. The control of Congress was firmly in Republican hands. And in many state legislatures and state governments, the Federalist Party was slowly fading away. And their association with the Hartford Convention and their whole opposition to the war now meant that that's the end of the Federalist Party. In the election of 1816, which was the next election after the war, there was still, I think, a Federalist candidate for the presidency. The Federalist Party, or what was left of it, it's almost down to nothing. They did manage to scramble around and they came up with somebody as a candidate. I don't even know who it was. Nobody knows. He did so poorly. I think the Federalist Party in the election of 1816, I think they carried one state. I think they carried Delaware. But the party was just almost gone. And by the next election in 1820, the Federalist Party was gone. In 1816, James Monroe was elected as president, the next in line of the Virginia Republicans. First there was Jefferson for 8 years, and then Madison for 8 years. Jefferson's elected in 1816, and he was reelected in 1820 without any opposition. And so, for all intents and purposes, he had a unanimous vote in the Electoral College. One of the Republican electors, sort of by arrangement, agreed not to vote for him, it had no impact on the election. Instead of being 100 to 0, it's now 99 to 1 or what the numbers were. I don't know how big the electoral college was at that time, but whatever it was, there was one vote against him, and they did it just for the symbolic idea that they would reserve the idea of a unanimous electoral vote to George Washington, that he would be the only president in American history to ever get a unanimous vote. But it didn't really matter for all intents and purposes. Monroe was reelected in 1820 unanimously. The Federalist Party was gone. That was the last nail in its coffin, which had been being built for some years, and it was sort of delayed because of the unpopularity of the war. But once the war was over, and all it did was make the Federalists look worse, and so the party's gone. With regard to the issues that led to the war, all of these maritime issues were really tough. The whole issue of neutral rights and impressment, we never did resolve those, but it became irrelevant. For the next century, basically, Europe remained at peace. Those were only issues because England was involved in a war with France, and England and its allies were involved in a big war against France and its allies. And that's what made the issue an issue. It was because England and France were both trying to prevent the United States from trading with their respective enemy, but there was never another war between them. And so the issue never came up again. And European history went on, things changed in Europe. It's not relevant to our class, but for almost exactly 100 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe was at peace. And so we didn't have to worry about the issue of impressment or neutral rights. And if you go on to take History 12, you know that in 1914, war broke out again in Europe. By that time, the situation in Europe had changed a lot, the whole situation of who's allies and so forth. England and France were now allies. They were on the same side this became World War I. They were on the same side against Germany. By that time, the English Navy had dropped impressment. They'd come up with other more modern methods of conscription, of drafting sailors that they needed for their navy. They were not using impressment. Neutral rights was an issue. We got into disputes with England over our trade because England tried to stop us from trading with Germany, but it's very complicated and it's not relevant to this class. It's key to understanding U.S. history in the 20th century, but that's not what we cover. So those issues went away, and we didn't have to worry about them. We were worried about the Indians blocking our expansion, and as I told you, that we solved. We got taken that out by killing Tecumseh. We were also after additional land. We wanted to have Canada and Florida. We were out for those. As you know, we never did get Canada, and we just finally had to accept the fact that Canadians don't want to be in the United States, or at least they did not then. They almost certainly do not now. So we had to accept that. We did sign in 1818 a treaty with England, which was still having Canada as a colony, and it established a boundary between Canada and the United States, and then there'd been some issues about where the boundary of the Louisiana Purchase territory was. We settled that with a treaty in 1818 that divided the British Empire in Canada from the United States south of that along the line of the 49th parallel. And we drove the 49th parallel out to the Rocky Islands and said north, or the Rocky Mountains. And we said that the territory north of that was the British Canada, the territory south was the United States. And it went out to the Rocky Mountains. It went from the Great Lakes out to the Rocky Mountains. The 49th parallel is the boundary that we agreed to. And And then west of that, west of the Rockies, we did something a little bit unusual. The two sides agreed to do what was called joint occupancy, which is again a concept that's a little bit strange, but it's something that's known in European diplomatic circles. And the idea is that that country, which then became known as the Oregon country would be not owned by either side, but both countries could have their citizens go there. That both Americans and Anglo or English Canadians could go into the Oregon country and just occupy it. They could occupy it jointly. And although the treaty doesn't say this, but the only thing they're going to be doing out there as of 1818 was to engage in the fur trade. So there's active fur trading by Americans and by the British subjects, and they're both involved in fur trading in the Oregon country, and they both will just be there. I mean, they're both British and American fur traders can go into the Oregon country and engage in their activity, and we don't have to decide whose territory it is. It's sort of joint territory. And that extended from the Rockies to the Pacific Ocean. And then on the north, the boundary was the line 5440, the latitude 5440, 54 degrees 40 minutes. And then to the south, that was now the Spanish. In 1819, we also settled a treaty with Spain called the Adams-Onis Treaty. The Adams-Onis Treaty, Adams was the U.S. negotiator. This is John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who's our Secretary of State, and he negotiated a treaty with Onis, the Spanish foreign minister, and they settled on the 42nd parallel as the southern boundary between Spanish California to the south and then the Oregon country, which was jointly occupied by the United States and Britain, and that's north of the 42nd parallel. So we settled all these border issues, we settled all these questions of territory in the West by negotiating treaties with England in 1818 and with Spain in 1819. Another feature of the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 between the United States and Spain was that the United States purchased Florida from Spain. So we did achieve the acquisition of Florida. We never acquired Canada, but we did get Florida. We got it sort of after the war was over by a negotiation with Spain as part of the whole sort of the settlement of all of these land issues in the West. And we got things worked out, and it's going to stay that way for a while. We're going to have to pick it up maybe a little bit later, and we'll see if I get that far, what's going to happen when we get to the 1840s. But as of 1818, 1819, land issues are settled, and people are sort of happy with it, and we've got things worked out. And as a result of it, we didn't get Canada, but we did get Florida, and we got things resolved as far as what the land is and what we have and what England has and so forth, and by accepting joint occupancy. And you know, joint occupancy works because there aren't any permanent settlers there. You don't have to worry about figuring out who owns the land because there's no people there owning the land. Of course, there's Indians, but as you know, we just sort of ignore them. Another consequence of the war was that, as I said, it meant that the Federalist Party will go away and the Republican Party will become the only party. But the Republican Party is going to change. It's not going to be the same party as back in the days of the 1790s when Jefferson was guiding the party and he was committed to this whole states' rights, state sovereignty, small government concept. And the party is different. One of Jefferson's classic ideas as the classic Republican Party, the good old days of the Republican Party when Jefferson was alive and when it was, a viable party and fighting against the Federalists back in the 1790s. One of the things that the Republican Party had always said was that the United States should remain a nation of small farmers. That was sort of a feature of the Republicans, and they always resisted the efforts of the Federalists like Hamilton to try to make the United States into some sort of an industrial, urbanized nation. And that was Hamilton was working with the bankers and the financiers and the people who were trying to get the United States more into a modern 19th century economy based on capital and so forth. And the Jeffersonians were classic agrarians who said, no, the United States should remain a nation of small farmers. And of course we know that we all need, the conveniences of modern life in the 19th century. We need manufactured goods. We can't just all live out on farms and with nothing there but the land and our labor. We need to have modern conveniences and modern comforts. So we need manufactured goods. We need a range of manufactured goods. But we don't have to manufacture them ourselves. We can import them. We can let England have the industrialization and all the problems that go with it. 19th century industrialization was a horrible experience. And England is this very wealthy nation, the leading industrial nation in the world, with these great manufacturing centers and so forth, and all of this production of modern manufactured goods. But it came at tremendous cost. England had, in the midst of all of its wealth and its success, it had immense patches of poverty. English industrial workers lived in horrible conditions. The living conditions for the working class in these great industrial centers of England, like Birmingham and Manchester and so forth, those were, people. There's some people, the industrialists, are making huge fortunes from those great industrial centers, but the workers are suffering under abominable living conditions. Life in the slums of the great English cities of the 19th century, the early 19th century, life was horrible. Sanitary conditions were terrible, working conditions were terrible, living conditions were terrible. The only good thing about life in those days was that it was really, really short. The life expectancy was, maybe in the mid-30s or something like that. Just terrible. And so Jefferson and American Republicans said, hey, we don't want that in the United States. Let England have it. Let them produce all those manufactured goods at great cost to them with all of the horrors that their working class has to endure. Let them do the production, and we'll just buy their goods. We'll just import stuff that we want and need. Because by being a nation of small farmers, we're going to have all of this agricultural goods to export. England is going to have to trade with us because they're going to have to sell us all of their manufactured goods real cheaply, because they're going to need our agricultural exports for their food in order to survive, because they don't have a big agricultural settlement anymore in England. It's become this great industrial nation. They're not producing nearly enough food to feed their people, so they have to import our food. So hey, the United States can have all of this trade with England and other industrial nations of Europe. England, of course, is the main one. We can have all this trade. We'll just import all of the goods we need, all of the manufactured goods, and then we'll just export our food to them. But we can have all of the benefits of modern industrial society in terms of all of these industrialized products that we can import, but we won't have any of the costs. We won't have to produce it ourselves. We'll just be a nation of farmers and healthy farm living and produce the goods that England will need. Well, if you kind of remember, that was what was the basis of the whole Embargo Act, was the faith in that concept, and it didn't work out. We realized that, wait a minute, this is not necessarily a sound strategy for the future here. Many Republicans are now questioning that. Many Republicans are saying that, wait a minute, if we're going to be truly independent of England, we have to have our own industrial base. We can't rely on importing industrial goods from England. That sort of keeps us as a dependent of England. If we want to be independent, we have to have a separate manufacturing capacity. And so at least some Republicans are questioning that traditional Jeffersonian agrarian faith and saying, no, the United States needs to become a modern industrial nation. And just as one of the sort of the manifestations of that, part of the whole federalist effort to sort of modernize the American economy was the Bank of the United States. You know, to establish a modern banking system as sort of a financial base for our economic growth. And as I said, the Republicans had always opposed that. And so when the charter of the bank expired in 1811, they just let it go. They said, we don't need a bank. This is America. We're a nation of small farmers. We don't need banks. We don't need finance. We don't need all of these other features of a capitalist society. We're an agrarian society, pre-capitalist, pre-industrial, and we can stay that way. And that blew up in our face. We realized that, wait a minute, we really could have used that bank during the war. So within the Republican Party, there are people who are Republicans, but they're acting more like Federalists. And of course, to some extent, this was inevitable because the people who would have been Federalists, because of their belief, because of their faith in industrial and economic progress, they would have gone to the Federalist Party, but there is no Federalist Party, so automatically they're Republicans. And I'll give you a name now. This is going to be a young Republican leader, but more in the mold of the old-time Federalists. His name was Henry Clay. Henry Clay is sort of like the example of the new Republicans, of the more modernized Republicans who sort of say, you know, yeah, it's fine to have farmers. I mean, they're not anti-agriculture, but they're just saying that if the United States is going to succeed, we also have to have industrialization, at least to some extent. So the Republicans, with this new leadership, this new outlook, the Republicans in 1816, when the war was over, passed a bill to establish the second Bank of the United States. They reestablished a Bank of the United States. They say that's, you know, one of the sort of foundations on which if you're going to build an industrial society, you have to have a solid money system, and the key to a solid money system is the Bank of the United States. So they established, and it's Republicans who were doing this. You know, the Republicans had been anti-banks, back in 1791. One of the reasons why the Republican Party got started was because they opposed Hamilton's plans for the Bank of the United States, and back in the day. But the day is no longer there. The day has changed. This is the new day, the new Republican Party, and the Republicans with Clay's leadership established a Bank of the United States. Another thing that happened during the war was that for a period of time there, the United States could not import goods from England, and that's one of the reasons why Republicans are now saying maybe we should have some industrialization, because when we were cut off from trade with England, we really suffered. When we had our own embargo, the other measures that we took to stop trade with England, and then during the war itself, we were not trading with England. And what happened during that time was that the manufacturing in the United States got started. There were several industries that started to develop in the United States during those war years, during the years roughly from, just say for a 10-year period, starting with the Berlin decrees, when our trade was really cut off one way or another. It's kind of complicated because it's up and down, it's back and forth. But there was a period of time there where we were not able to import goods from England, so we started manufacturing them ourselves. And there were several industries that got started in the United States. And they're just getting started. Most of our factories that developed were small. They barely survive. And as a matter of fact, one of the reasons that they depend on to survive is that we're not importing the goods from England, because England could outproduce us and produce them a lot cheaper than we could. Labor is very cheap in England. It's not cheap in the United States. So the English or the American manufacturing that got started is only going to survive as long as we're not trading with England. And so they're very fragile. They're called infant industries, is a term that economists use. Infant industries, that meaning that they're very young and they're just getting smart, they're just getting started, and they're really not very sound or very stable financially. They're not very successful from a business standpoint. They're just learning to walk and just barely getting started. But that did happen. And one industry in particular is going to become sort of the first leading industry in the United States. And it's not a surprise. It's an industry that in many countries was sort of the first industrial development for that country. I'm not that much familiar with world history, but I know that, like nations like in the late 19th, early 20th century, India and Japan followed this same course. They were in those countries, sort of the first industry to develop was this industry. It had been the first industry in England back in the 17th century, when England was leading the way in the Industrial Revolution. The key industry was the same as the sort of the first industry in the United States. And that's the textile industry, the manufacture of clothing. And that's a sort of a natural, logical first industry to have, because clothing is such a basic human need. I mean, everybody needs clothing, and so there's always a demand for textiles. And so it's just kind of a logical first step for countries to take if they're going to try to go into an industrialized mode and come out of being an all agricultural nation. Historically, England had been, as I said, for them the first industry was the textile industry. The raw material was not a surprise. It was wool. I mean, that's what you did. That was the raw material. That's all there was. And so, in fact, the textile industry in England was often referred to as the woolen industry. And there's legislation about it called Woolen Acts and so forth, because that was the industry. The woolen industry was the manufacture of textiles. And that's still very important. I mean, it is to this day. We still make a lot of wool clothing in our modern day economy. But something had changed, and it started in the United States in the 1790s when a guy named Eli Whitney in New England, had invented a machine called the cotton gin, the cotton engine or cotton gin. Now, cotton had been around for a long time, and people knew about cotton. People knew that cotton could be used to make textiles that were very comfortable, very sturdy, and a lot easier and cheaper to make than woolens. But the cotton was not a real viable product for commercial purposes. You could grow it, and people did grow it. People in Mexico have been growing cotton for hundreds of years, and they knew how to make textiles out of it, and they did make textiles out of cotton, but it required very intense hand labor to pull the seeds out of the cotton fibers. The way cotton as a plant grows is that the seeds are covered in this bowl of cotton fibers, and so they have to be sorted out by hand, and that just was a very labor-intensive, very tedious job. To do any kind of significant large-scale manufacturing, cotton was not available. It just wasn't practical to use it. You couldn't do it. I mean, we did grow cotton in this country, but not a major thing because it just took a lot of hand labor. And as a matter of fact, that was one of the tasks that slaves performed, was separating cotton seeds out of the fiber so the fiber could be used to make into a textile. The cotton gin made it possible to sort out the seeds in the cotton in large scale, so that we started now being able to use cotton for a raw material. So the textile industry is going to get started in the United States, and it's going to start using increasingly. It still used a lot of wool because that's what everybody knew, and that's what all the technology was based on, using wool. But increasingly we're going to start using cotton instead, and that's going to transform the American economy. So I'll have to stop now, and in our next lecture we'll look at the development of the textile industry in America. One of the things that happened was that as this started, once the war with England was over and we were starting to manufacture our own textiles, English textile manufacturers said, ho, 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 we can't let this go on. We haven't been able to sell our products to the American market for several years because of all of these trade interruptions, the Orders in Council, the Embargo Act, etc., etc. And then for a couple of years there, the war. As a matter of fact, English manufacturers of textiles had large stocks that they'd stashed away in warehouses as they tried to keep producing, but they couldn't sell it all, and so there's huge supplies of textiles in reserve in England, and so they started to dump them on the American market once the trade was resumed, and their intent, of course, was to destroy the American textile industry so that they could get back to controlling it. So the textile industry, which was very small anyway, was facing with this English competition and threatened by its very existence, because we couldn't manufacture the textiles as cheaply as England, especially when England, I mean, they're selling them at a loss just to unload the supplies that they've got. So the textile industry is facing this rivalry that threatens to destroy them. For protection, they went to Congress, and Congress passed tariff laws. They raised tariffs on textiles significantly and imposed a large number of other tariffs designed to protect American manufacturing against English competition. And this is another part then, the Tariff Act of 1816 is another part sort of the new Republican agenda for America, led by Henry Clay. Well, my time is up, so I have to stop. We'll pick up with this point in our next class. Oh, the question. the question is, what event was the great event that made Andrew Jackson into a national hero? Now you can go.